Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Jamarr Brown. He is a campaign strategist working as executive director of Color of Change PAC, where he leads the fundraising and program operations to support candidates that will bring about essential and transformative changes within the criminal justice system. So, welcome to the show, Jamarr.
Well, good to be with you, David. Glad to be here. We have some really critical issues to talk about, but in the midst of everything going on, I'm glad I get to join you for hopefully it will be a robust conversation.
Yeah. So, we're going to be talking a lot today about DEI, which has unfortunately been in the news a lot. And kind of, I don't know if this is fair to say, and maybe you can correct me, but to me, this kind of snuck up on us. It's like, I feel like we've been doing DEI for a long time, and all of a sudden it's become this buzzword for the counter narrative from the right. What are
Mhm.
your thoughts on that?
Well, it probably feels that way, David, quite frankly, because everything has happened so fast. Obviously, as we all know, the Trump administration has been in office less than a month, and right, the very one of the very first things they did was order a rollback of programs and protections at the federal level, and then we're starting to see that at colleges and universities. We're starting to see that in school districts. We're seeing that in corporations across the board, and this has all happened so rapidly. But what I'll share with you and your viewers is I would challenge people to think of what's happened, particularly leading up to this election. We know that there was Project 2025. It was a 900-page plan that basically outlined everything that the Trump administration was going to do. Even though we campaigned very aggressively in the election across many states that this plan was going to be dangerous, not just for Black communities, but for many communities of people. And the DEI rollback was a huge part of that. Also, in addition to the rollback of the Department of Education. But what I'll challenge you is to look, for example, and using this state as an example, if you look at places like Texas, during the last legislative session 2 years ago, Texas actually passed a law that restricted colleges and universities that received college funding from administrating DEI programs, which we saw colleges in Texas start and all over the country start to lay off workers who worked under those programs, especially folks who are working on diversifying admissions to various colleges and universities around the country. And so, quite frankly, we've been seeing this at the state level in states where radical right conservative legislators had super majorities or close to super majorities as well. And so now we're seeing that as part of the Project 2025 plan that they've talked about, that Trump claimed he didn't know about. And then now, obviously, with Donald Trump being in the White House along with his friend Elon Musk being in the White House, they're advancing these initiatives. And so we've been seeing this rollback, quite frankly, for the last 2, 3, 4 years. But it more so happened at the state and local level where conservative politicians were in control. So yes, it feels like it's us all of a sudden because it's happened so fast in the last few weeks. But I challenge folks to do some research that it's been happening for a few years, and they have the seat of the White House now to execute these kind of rollbacks.
Yeah. So, I mean, what is DEI? Because I feel like that's part of the problem is that people don't really understand what DEI actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, the acronym itself stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And to be quite honest, we know that these programs had a vision, particularly around building civil rights protections and building communities and keeping folks safe. And actually, a lot of these programs were really started to reduce discrimination in a number of ways. It either reduced discrimination in how people access professional opportunities, how folks access academic opportunities, but also in particular, how folks access financial opportunities. We actually saw a lot of discrimination, especially in the middle of the 20th century, around like discrimination in housing and mortgage lending. And then we see it also in healthcare, right? And so how folks access healthcare, right? So that if you showed up to a hospital or you showed up to a doctor's office, there was a difference in treatment based on gender, based on race, and also diversity, equity, and inclusion. I would challenge folks to also respect that it's not just about helping Black people. While Black people help lead the charge, it helps white women, it helps the Hispanic community, it helps the AAPI community, the Native community. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this is about saying across these systems that were built in our country, right? Like I mentioned, financial, academic, healthcare, across all these systems that were not built for people who are cisgender white men, how do we begin to look at systems to level the playing field, to give people access to opportunities, not to give a handout, but access to real opportunities so that they can build the lives that they want for themselves, their families, and their communities. And that's been the goal of DEI programs over several decades. And so now to see this rollback of DEI programs by the Trump administration in particular is saying we're actually going to roll back those opportunities. And when they use the narrative around merit, that's also dangerous because merit has been qualified in a number of ways. And merit has not always been fair, even when white women, people of color, etc., would show up, right, and meet the standard, they still didn't receive the opportunity or the reward based on merit as well. And so that's what DEI is. That's what DEI is from our perspective. And what we're fighting for is to say, no, we're not standing back and asking people to give a handout. We're asking to say, make the opportunities fair, make the playing field fair, and we'll step up as communities, as individuals, and do the work necessary to not just attain, but also take advantage of those opportunities.
And talk a little bit about colorblind policies, because I feel like people kind of misinterpret this, that they'll quote Martin Luther King, right? We need and they kind of misunderstand Martin Luther King. Well, they don't kind of, they definitely misunderstand Martin Luther King, because Martin Luther King, while he gave the I Have a Dream speech, he also wrote a lot about the fact that in those days the terminology was Negroes, and the fact that Negroes were held down by these policies, and the need to do specific policies to bring those folks back up. And so colorblind, kind of ignores all this history of racism. It ignores systemic racism. It ignores institutional racism, and it just says, oh, we should be treating everybody equal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important point to make. And I mean, if you want to look at the real history of this country, we were divided by race and color in this country. People came to this country enslaved. People were enslaved in this country because of color, basically, of their skin, right? Where, most folks will quote Dr. King around not just by the color of your skin, but the content of your character, right? But that was the racial division that the country itself was founded on. And so when you see laws like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, it's not about giving Black people a handout, as I said in the last answer. It's also about saying we're leveling this thing out to right a wrong that was done to a group of people where we were seen as 3/5 human and all those different things. And so now when folks are, really saying that we're navigating colorblind policy, or this is not directed at that, well, unfortunately, the way the systems were built up, it was built to divide those colors. And so what you're also saying when you are saying we're having colorblind policy is also saying we don't see your color, or we don't acknowledge some of the systemic challenges that were put in your way in the formation of this country, or how systems are actually operating and run in communities. And so the worst thing that people can say to me, even personally, right, as a Black person in this country is, well, I'm colorblind. And I was like, well, I am a Black person. I'm very proud of who I am. I'm very proud of my heritage and my history, even of struggle and resilience in this country. And you're saying you don't see me. And so if you don't see me as an individual based on the color of my skin, you probably are going to be blind to the systemic challenges. You're going to be blind to the inequities that have existed in these various forms over the course of time. And so when folks go and say that I'm navigating colorblind policies, yes, they're making policies that impact people of color, but not choosing to see the factors that have impacted people of color, and therefore are still making decisions moving forward. And that's actually quite dangerous for the country.
I agree. And I was reading this book actually yesterday, and there were a couple of interesting quotes I just wanted to throw out there.
Yeah.
There just seems to be a general confusion in the difference between using race to segregate as opposed to using it to integrate. And
Mhm.
then this was kind of interesting too. They were talking about Chief Justice John Roberts, and he has this kind of belief that any effort to eradicate racial discrimination is itself racial discrimination, which seems to be ludicrous, but that
Mhm.
seems to be where we're going with
Yeah.
eliminating DEI.
Yeah, and I think because we're having deeper conversations, David, about race in this country and the factors and the role that race has played in where the country is, where the country is going, in ways that we potentially probably did not have in previous decades and election cycles. It's almost like this reverse racism thing that's happening. And this is what we have to be careful about, right? And what we're seeing in these programs, because what Donald Trump and his extremist allies are saying is DEI programs are actually um, restricting people of opportunities, but what they're not telling you is that it's restricting you, white cisgender white men of certain opportunities, and it's not saying that we're going to take a black woman or a Hispanic woman or a white woman even and just put them over a white man. It's about saying that white cisgender men have gotten opportunities just based on who they are and what they look like. And now, because these programs have leveled the playing field, there's almost like a reverse racism and a white lash, if you want to call it that, that's happening. And this is why we're seeing the attacks on these systems and these programs and various initiatives, also as well. And so, for them to maintain power, for them to maintain access to capital, they want to reverse these programs because people have used their merits, even in the midst of these opportunities, right, to access progress forward. And so that's what we're particularly saying. And so now these eliminating these protections for our communities and other historically marginalized communities is absolutely essential. And that's what we're seeing. And it's almost like this white lashing that's happening as well. And I think that's important to also acknowledge. This is why they're doing it, is because people who they don't want to have access to power and to capital in this country are gaining that because the doors are opening, the field is level, and then now people are going to get educated. People are going to get degrees. People are getting certifications. People are getting trainings. People are getting into workspaces and work positions that allow them to actually compete at the same table with white men. And that's been the point of DEI programs, is just to level it out. And then you can talk about merit once you've leveled the playing field. And so now they're seeing that they want to take that power and access to capital back. And now they're encouraging, through using the federal government almost as a testing rod, of how to roll back those programs and ensure the power and protection for themselves, quite frankly.
Yeah, and you mentioned white lash, and I think, and this is just my personal belief, but that Trumpism has actually majority fueled by this kind of white lash, that
Mhm.
it's the white sectors of society that have lived under white privilege, and now they see their numerical majority threatened. Now they see potentially their economic hegemony threatened, and they're lashing back at people of color, immigrants, and
Right.
trying to hold on to the power that they once had.
Right. And actually, I'll challenge us, David, in this conversation too, is to take a step back even before Trumpism. Let's take a step back to when Barack Obama was elected president. Because I actually think it started a while even before that, but I think we really saw the rise of this kind of racial division in the modern history, really around different communities, even including white people, actually electing Barack Obama in 2008. I'll share a personal experience. I went to college down south. I'm from South Carolina. And actually, my professor, I was taking a political theory class actually that semester when Barack Obama was elected. And the election was obviously Tuesday. I had class the next day, and we would talk about conservative philosophy, more progressive philosophy, right, over the course of time. And my professor was a former campaign manager of Lindsey Graham, who's a senator, Republican senator. He worked on Republican campaigns, but was a teacher at the school. I went to school in a very conservative area of South Carolina. And the first thing he said that morning was, "The South will rise again." Less than 24 hours after we elected the first Black president. And so this is in the classroom, right? I'm at a major, university. And so when you see and you experience things of that nature, and then, Mitch McConnell standing there and saying, we're not going to allow him do anything, where they work to fight against things like healthcare, or they work to fight against, saving the auto industry, right? Solely because they did not want to have to cede power, not just to this one Black man that was elected to the highest office in the land, but that other people would come along and other communities have galvanized and really organized. And so then you saw the backlash really begin in 2010, right? Where this rise of what you call the Tea Party movement. And so when you see the Tea Party movement, it was very much, when you look at the crowds, very much white people, especially down south, where I'm from. And then you see this thing where President Donald Trump came in and said, we question his citizenship, right? These little things like this is what is given the sign and the message of still this kind of racial divide that they wanted to keep, but they wanted to fly under the radar with it. And a lot of times I always make jokes, not jokes, but, I always make the illusion that, they went from white hoods to Navy suits. And that's just the difference. But the standard is the same about how white people feel that they should be in power. And these programs actually help fight their power. And then you see Trump rise in 2016. And so this started way, 10 years even before Donald Trump ran for president. And even was a part of that movement and even fueling that fire also as well. Even to the point where Donald Trump would not concede the 2020 election. Let's be honest, right? When you look at the numbers of the folks in the electorate, it was a majority people of color that elected Joe Biden, right? When you look at Black communities, you look at Hispanic communities, you look at AAPI communities, Native communities, especially in places like Arizona out west. And so, and because in that election, white women voted for Donald Trump in that election, right? And so not even just electing, and so you can see the racial divide in two different elections, right? In 2008, we elected a African-American person as the president. And in 2020, we elected a white man with majority people of color. And you still saw the racial divide, right? And so then you saw this kind of continued determination also as part of the Tea Party movement, where we saw Republicans take over state legislatures. So then they started passing laws such as the voter ID laws, right, in places like South Carolina and Texas and Alabama and Tennessee. Then you saw the rollback of Medicaid programs and Medicaid fundings, right, that impact rural communities where a lot of Black people in the South live. And so we've seen over the course of not just the 10 years that Trump's been on the scene as a candidate or as president, but even almost 10 years before that, with the country coming together and electing the first African American. And so why I allude to some of this whitewashing is that we've never seen in this kind of way where communities of color have come together. We've never had an African American president. We've only had, for as I know, cisgender white men as president. And so even ceding to that power or having to respect the power of the presidency being in the hands of someone who didn't look like them was very challenging. And we saw that they built a movement around that message and actually galvanized and elected people from school boards to state legislatures to even members of Congress, and therefore eventually a president. And so this has been a movement for the last 20 years of our modern history.
So I completely agree with that. I think, the history is pretty clear that the Obama presidency triggered this racial threat in a segment of society, and Donald Trump has exploited that.
Mhm.
I wonder if you have thoughts, and I have my own, but
Mhm.
I wanted to see your thoughts. How best to start combating that? Because obviously, if you look at history of this country, we've seen this kind of, okay, there's progress, and then all of a sudden we go backwards. rights. And this
Right.
happened, after the Civil War with Reconstruction, and after a certain point, um, the radical Republicans who were driving some of the change and Reconstruction gave up. And
Mhm.
we saw this, after the Civil Rights Movement, that there was this backlash. And we're seeing it again. Um, it, it, I mean, I would hate to say, oh, do we have to wait another 50 years to wait this out? I don't know that I
Yeah.
have another 50 years personally. Um, but do you have other thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this is what's important, David, and this is the work that we're doing at Color of Change Pack is there has to be a long-term strategy, right? And the thing that, what the Republicans have done, this isn't something even to the one of the first questions you asked me, like came all of a sudden. They've been planning this for the last 20, 30 years, if not longer, right? Some of these things, they had to get certain positions of power, right? State legislatures, governorships, even getting a president to appoint conservative Supreme Court justices, where they were able to roll back Roe versus Wade, right after 52 years, as a legal precedent for women to make decisions about their own bodies, for example, right? And so for us, it's important to make sure that we have a long-term strategy that is 30 to 50 year. To really, even if I'm not the Color of Change Pack ED in 50 years, which I probably won't be, but thinking long term enough to say, what are the mechanisms that we need to do? We have to constantly run people for office, right? And I'm not just even just saying Black people, but people who believe in progress for all communities, that are running for office. We have to organize our voters, and in our case, we focus on Black voters. We worked last cycle, through our digital campaign, through our voter contact campaign, and our other paid media. We worked to organize 8 million Black people in over 7 states. And so we have to do that every cycle. Win, lose, or draw, we have to make sure that engagement is the key for our communities. We have to run people for office. We have to participate in the census. We have to participate in redistricting. We have to hold our elected officials accountable at every level. That does sometimes mean you have to vote out your own electeds and replace them with somebody who's better, that can think forward for the community, also as well. And then I think there's this broader conversation outside of those tactical things. Is there's always a conversation on our side of the aisle, if you want to call it that, is there's this identity politics that comes up, right? It's, what are you going to do for Black communities? What are you going to do for brown communities? What are you going to do for this community, LGBTQ communities, people of different, who are differently abled, etc. And the conversation has to be, yes, we acknowledge people's identities, because that's actually how the country was founded, quite frankly. But also, how do we get back to the root issues of what people are dealing with? And so, what we're learning, even in our post election debriefs, right, is how do you message directly to people, right? Because let's be honest, all of us, no matter what color we are, what the color of our skin, or what ethnicity we are, we all want to live in a nice, stable home. We all want to make sure we can eat and afford to eat. We can make sure that we can afford to get to work. All want decent jobs. We all want health care. Now, maybe how we go about getting healthcare is a little bit differently, right? But the issues that really matter in terms of the progress of communities can't be lit in color and identity politics, because at the end of the day, people have to be able to have an opportunity to vote and to advocate and advance issues and policies based on the fundamental need of that particular voter and that particular community. And I think that that's an important piece, that we have to acknowledge people's identity, but work to message to get past some of that. Because what Donald Trump has done is say, people from Mexico are rapists and terrorists. And it's absolutely unacceptable. And that's not reflective of that community. But we've allowed that narrative, for example, to go on for a long time. And they actually get to paint these different communities of people that way. So the white extremist voters that they have then turn their eye toward communities they don't feel deserve progress, opportunities, and justice anyway. Then they turn a blind eye to everything that we've talked about as part of this conversation. And so what I actually have challenged, I went on CNN about it, so you can quote me, but I've also challenged, Democratic candidates, progressive organizations, progressive movements on behalf of Color of Change Pack to do is, how do we get back to the roots of the issues and really organizing around the issues and connecting people back? Because we know that the radical right will continue to name call and do those things. And when we get caught up in a culture war, we're never going to win that, because the people who are driving that culture war most likely don't look like most people who are voting for us. And so at the end of the day, those are some of the things that we tactically have to do, but also using the mechanism of government, using the mechanisms of the financial industry, and then using things such as the census and redistricting, because we also have to know that the census is also connected to funding for communities and resources. We also know the census is connected to your political representation, especially at the state and local levels, which we're particularly more focused on in this year. And so those processes, while sometimes flawed, we still have to have a real strategy to participate in them, because those are opportunities to engage more people in the political world, but also build opportunities to protect communities, but also advance communities and issues that are important to them.
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back to an important point that you made. And, earlier I had referenced the quote from John Roberts. The book I'm reading talks about when John Roberts was at the Department of Justice in the Reagan administration. So we're talking about 1982, right?
Right.
So unfortunately for me, over 40 years ago, and you could probably go back to the Nixon administration and some of the Southern strategy stuff and him changing the Supreme Court. So we're talking 40, 50 years for the right to kind of change the dynamics of the courts, and also, kind of being on the attack here. The other thought I have, and I'd love to get your take on it. I mean, and maybe you talked about it in a different way, but one of the interesting things about what happened in South Africa after apartheid was that they decided to do a different approach to change, and they did what they called their Truth and Reconciliation program, which is basically restorative justice. And it seems to me that one of the problems that we have in this country is that we've never had any kind of reconciliation. We've never had any real, I don't even know what word I want to use, to apologize or to acknowledge even, the evils of slavery, the evils of Jim Crow. I think there are layers upon layers of harm that has occurred. And we talked about the fact that there are folks that are used to running this country, used to being in control, that are feeling threatened. And one of the ways that South Africa tried to deal with this, and we can discuss how successful, but they haven't gone to a civil war, in part because they kind of had this reconciliation, and we've never done that in this country.
Right. Well, I think there's a couple things I think to acknowledge as to that question, and I think that's important. And I think there's two parts of reconciliation for me, at least. That when I think of especially Black communities that have faced harm and are still, quite frankly, some ways facing a lot of harm, is there is reconciliation through apology. And I think that we've seen that happen in some cities and some states that probably are a little more progressive, not in a large formal way nationally, of course. And then I think that there's also reconciliation through policy and through policy advancement. And so I believe, that when we look at especially the legislation that came out of the 60s, right? The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, et cetera. We're seeing, even legislation that came in the 90s, even recently, some of the executive orders, for example, that President Biden even signed, especially around drug charges, where that historically marginalized a lot of Black men in this country. in particular, right? And so we've seen some of that broadly. And then also there's this reconciliation almost of resource, if you want to call it that. And not saying that DEI is a reconciliation, but I think DEI is a result of what that framework could look like, right? In terms of what I've said before, is how do we look at leveling the playing field? Yes, harm was done. Yes, these systems are flawed. They were built flawed. They were built, quite frankly, a lot of them to be flawed. But now in this modern history that we want to be more progressive, not so much in the political philosophy, but progressive in the aspect of moving toward, making this a free country and a just country for all. Then we start looking at these programs across different institutions, right? That also says, yes, an apology might be one thing, legislation is another, but when we move the resources and we move the dollars and we create the opportunities that people can experience politics, people can experience systems in a different way than previous generations have, I think is important. And so that's why we are fighting so hard, for example, to protect DEI programs also as well. And then another point that you kind of made around, especially with Justice Roberts, is we really saw a tilting of the court system, which negatively impacted and marginalized a lot of African Americans, right? We saw in the 80s that they created the war on drugs, but then they appointed more white conservative justices at all levels of the court. That's when we saw Sandra Day O'Connor. We saw Clarence Thomas be nominated to the Supreme Court, right? Where then laws were also protected in the courts that marginalized communities, right? That therefore, to your point, created a lot of the harm, right? And then what we've tried to do also at Color of Change, particularly, and I'm using this just kind of lane as an example, this criminal justice lane, is we've worked also to ensure that, we have tried to help reform the system. And so one of the things we've done over the last 10 years is work to elect more progressive prosecutors, right? Where prosecutors were manipulating in some cases or overexerting in many other cases some of these laws that came out of the 80s and maybe even early 90s that were still on the books and still causing harm in marginalized communities. And so we work to elect district attorneys, right? We've supported judicial candidates in states that, judicial candidates would be on the ballot where people can actually elect their prosecutors and their judges. We have worked to elect and reelect prosecutors around the country last year. In this last presidential election, even in the midst of the presidential election and in the elections for Congress and at every level. And so also part of the reconciliation is also putting elected officials, galvanizing voters, right, to hold them accountable and putting them in place to also look at the law in a more compassionate way. We're not asking people to just let people off the hook. But what we are asking is saying use a compassionate view of what could be a flawed law in many states or even federal law if you're at that level, and also have some consideration for the factors that may lead that person to be interacting with the criminal justice system. And then what do we think about? If someone is a danger to the community, yes, they need to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But if someone is not a violent threat to the community or is charged with a nonviolent crime, and maybe it's their first offense, then what are the kind of diversion programs? What are some of the other things and other factors that may be at play with these systems that that person is experiencing harm in the community, therefore causing harm or potentially committing a crime or being accused of committing a crime? And so when you ask that question about, reconciliation, I think it looks a number of different ways. But it is also, yes, an apology would be great. There's the mental health of our communities, but it's also about laws and changing the systems. It's also about moving resources to reinforce the changing of the system and opening opportunities for people to participate in changing the system. And then therefore also holding stakeholders who are responsible for protecting communities and advancing policy that helps those communities also accountable. So I think it comes in a number of ways.
All right. Well, we're almost out of time, but I want to bring up one more point to kind of circle this back to DEI.
Oh, mm-hmm.
So, people think of DEI as kind of this racial balance, but there's another aspect to it, and that is fostering an inclusive environment where everyone, and it could happen at a university, it could happen in a workplace, but anyone, regardless of background, feels supported and have equitable opportunities to succeed. That's really what's at stake here, right?
Absolutely. And I also want to challenge people. Yes, some of the frameworks of DEI were started because of a lot of the racial segregation and division and lack of opportunity in the country. But I also will challenge people who are listening to also look at DEI as another way. DEI also impacts women. DEI also impacts people of the LGBTQ community. It protects veterans. It protects people of different levels of education. It protects people who are differently able. It protects people of different religions and different faiths, and or advances opportunities for them, right? And so when we talk about diversity, we tend to just go to race in this country because just how our conversations have been about race and identity politics. But it's also about more than that. And I'll challenge people also to think about that a lot of us hold multiple different things, right? You have a gender and a race, right? And you may be impacted by those other classified communities. And so also DEI brought outside of just opportunities for people to advance and succeed and level the playing field, but DEI also brought civil rights protections so that when people wanted to engage in those opportunities, they're also protected by the law and they're protected in workplaces and in other systems. And so I challenge people to also think about that too, that this isn't just about black and white in the way that it's being painted by the Trump administration. It's also about so many other factors that make up who we are as a country.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Jamarr, for
Absolutely.
coming on and having this very important and timely discussion. I think this is one of the more critical issues that we're facing, and unfortunately, I don't think we're going in the right direction, but hopefully we can turn the ship around.
Yeah, and we're fighting. And I hope folks will follow us at Color of Change, Color of Change PAC. Follow us on our website, votingwhileblack.org, Voting While Black on all social media profiles. And, we're fighting every day to hold elected officials at all levels accountable. And so hopefully folks will join us in that effort too. And we want to change that narrative, David, so that when we're having this conversation in a few years, we're actually talking about how people are being helped and people are being advanced versus feeling under attack because they're participating in these programs.
Sounds good. We've been talking with Jamarr Brown. He is the executive director of Color of Change PAC. And this has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com. That's Justice for George Powell, all one word, .com.